Hello, my name is Kayla White, and I'm in Miss Leanne Smith's SEC 352 Planning for Student Diversity course for the fall semester. For this assignment, I will be carefully analyzing the textbook Intro to Business by DeLabay, Burrow, and Eglund. This textbook is designed to meet the needs of high school students who will be taking an introductory business course such as Business Principles. This book covers various topics that directly introduce students to the business world. It shares success stories, helpful tips, and basic business skills. The main goal of this assignment is to determine if this textbook is appropriate for classroom use. To decide if this book should be used, I'll be gathering and analyzing data from both Unit 2, which is Business Organization and Management, and Unit 3, which is Business Operations and Technology. Chapter 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 fall under Unit 2, while Chapter 10 falls under Unit 3. To analyze this textbook, I will access the state standards and specifically the KOSA standards. According to the Kentucky Department of Education, the KOSA is one of two measures that can be given to students to meet the career-ready technical portion of college and career readiness. KOSA tests are aligned to career and technical education career pathways, which includes business principles. The first standard I'll be analyzing is Standard 2005.0B.2. It states that the text must be able to describe types of organizational structures and management levels. To determine if this standard was met, I asked the question, how many chapters within Unit 2, Chapter 5 through Chapter 9, address and thoroughly discuss organizational structures and management levels? After collecting the data, I concluded that the only chapters that discussed organizational structures and management levels were Chapter 5, which discussed it in one section, and Chapter 7, which discussed these key concepts twice. I collected data with the assumption that bold vocabulary words such as organization chart, top management, mid-management, and supervisors would be present in the chapter with thorough definitions following them. The data collected clearly shows that the most important information related to the standard is featured in Chapter 5 and Chapter 7. After careful evaluation, I determined that the standard was not met because the key concepts were only discussed briefly. The next standard I used to examine the textbook is Standard 2005.0J.2, which states that the textbook should be able to teach students how to develop a marketing mix plan, i.e., product, price, distribution, and promotion for a business. To determine if this standard was met, I asked the question, what percentage of the Communicate Business Concepts questions at the end of each chapter met the standard Develop a Marketing Mix? I carefully collected the data to prove whether or not the standard was met. I used Bloom's revised taxonomy to categorize the questions into higher order thinking, which required students to evaluate and create, medium order thinking, which required students to apply, analyze, and evaluate, and lower order thinking, which required students to simply understand and remember. For example, one question asked students to identify 3 businesses from their community that are not marketing businesses. This question accesses a lower level of thinking because it is just asking students to understand and remember. Although 43% of the questions accessed a medium order of thinking and 14% accessed a higher order of thinking, only one question accessed the marketing mix. I collected my data based on the standard's action word develop, which falls under Bloom's create category. Although one question addressed the marketing mix, it did not prompt students to develop anything. The standard was not met simply because students primarily used lower and medium levels of thinking and rarely reached a higher level. The last standard I used to analyze this textbook based on the KOSA standards was 2005.EK.4, which expressed that the text must convey instructions that students could use to prepare a resume, letter of application, and job application. Within the chapter at question, I found photographed examples of each of the business documents stated in the standard. I examined the rest of the chapter and asked the question, how many chapters within the unit demonstrate the preparation of a resume, letter of application, and job application? I collected data from chapters 5 through 9 and concluded that instructions to prepare a resume, letter of application, and job application could only be found in Chapter 9. The chapter has an entire section called Applying for Employment that is designed to address the standard and instruct students on how to create these documents. The main purpose of the chapter is to introduce students to the various steps that must be taken to obtain a job, which directly correlates with the standard being used. If the textbook had neglected to meet this standard, students would be unclear on how the employment process works, and it is possible that their post-grad life could suffer. Although only one chapter within the unit had the components discussed in the standard, I would say that this textbook met the standard. Preparation of a resume, letter of application, and job application are very specific skills, and Chapter 9 does a very good job describing how students should complete these documents because it provides photographed examples and step-by-step instructions. After careful analysis of the textbook and using various methods to collect data, I determined that only one of the 3 KOSA standards were met. Therefore, this textbook would not be an effective tool that should be used in an introductory business course such as Business Principles. The second way that I will be analyzing the textbook is by examining 3 different diversity dimensions. The 3 dimensions that I chose were race, gender, and age. The first dimension I'll be discussing is race. In order to determine if this textbook represented an array of different races, I asked the question: how well does the race of the people pictured in Unit 2 reflect the population of the United States? I went through the chapter and carefully examined the pictures. I collected my data based on the assumption that a person's race is strongly correlated to a person's physical characteristics, such as skin color, facial structure, and hair texture. After collecting my data, I determined that some races were more represented than others throughout the unit. I utilized the 2010 census to gather data about the various races in the United States, such as Caucasian, African American, Asian, Hispanic, and biracial. I determined that an individual was biracial if they had characteristics that correlated with 2 different races. As seen in the pie graphs, the textbook is dominantly representative of one race. 60% of the individuals pictured in Unit 2 were Caucasian, which is significantly more than the other races portrayed in the textbook. Although this may seem uniform, when the data is compared to the data gathered from the U.S. Census, it is very similar to the racial makeup of the United States. A Caucasian student may not feel disadvantaged from the lack of diversity because they are similar to the individuals in the book. But a student who is Hispanic or biracial may have a hard time relating to this textbook, which can greatly influence their learning. According to the data gathered from Unit 2, this textbook does meet the diversity dimension because it has a similar racial breakdown as the United States. The next aspect of diversity that I examined was gender. I used the Global Business Project sections at the end of each unit to determine which gender was more represented in the text. These sections share business success stories from various companies around the United States. To determine if this diversity dimension was met, I asked the question: which gender is dominantly represented in the Global Business Project sections found at the end of each unit? I assumed that males had short hair, stronger facial features, were larger in stature, and could have visible facial hair. I assumed that females had long hair, softer facial features, and were smaller in stature. According to the data collected from the textbook, 75% of the individuals photographed in the Global Business Project sections were female, and 25% of the individuals were male. I also accessed the United States Census to gather information about the breakdown of males and females within the United States. According to the 2010 census data, 49.2% of the individuals in the U.S. were female and 50.8% were male, which is about equal, whereas females are overwhelmingly represented in the textbook. This could cause a consequence in the classroom. Male students may feel neglected and inferior to their female peers, and they could be discouraged from pursuing business careers. This diversity standard was not met simply because females are more fiercely illustrated than males. The last diversity dimension that I examined to analyze the textbook was age. To determine if the appropriate age groups were represented in the text, I examined the pictures and asked the question: how well do the age groups pictured in Unit 2 reflect the population of the United States? I categorized the individuals into 3 groups: persons under 18, persons 40 to 60, and persons 65 and over. I made these distinctions based on the assumptions that persons under 18 had soft facial features, were smaller in stature, and typically pictured in school or recreational activities. I assumed that persons 40 to 60 had mature facial features, males had visible facial hair, and were typically pictured in office settings. Finally, I assumed that persons who were 65 and over had visible wrinkles, gray hair, and beards, and were smaller in stature and typically pictured in office settings. After collecting the data, I found that persons 40 to 60 were the most represented group in the textbook, making up 73% of the individuals pictured. Once again, I accessed the U.S. Census to compare my data gathered in the textbook to the United States. According to the U.S. Census conducted in 2010, only 26.4% of individuals in the United States were categorized as persons 40 to 60. Therefore, the data I collected was not comparable to the U.S. Census. Since such a great portion of the individuals fell under the persons 40 to 60 group, high school students may feel that this text is not directed at their needs. I came to the conclusion that the diversity dimension age was not met because of the 3 groups of people were not equally represented, and persons under 18, which would be the age group that's represented in the classroom, was only represented a minimal amount of times. Based on my careful analysis of the 3 diversity dimensions, race, gender, and age, this textbook is not diverse and should not be used in an introductory business course. Of the 3 dimensions I chose, only one met the diversity standards. The final way that I will be analyzing this textbook is by using the Lexile scoring measurement. This is a tool that can be used to determine if a textbook is opportune for a certain grade level. In order to determine the Lexile score for the textbook Intro to Business, I type the introductory paragraphs from each of the careers and business sections found at the beginning of each chapter into the score analyzer on the Lexile website. The textbook Intro to Business received a score of 1,000. The average score for a textbook for an 11th grade classroom is 940 to 1,210. This textbook would be appropriate for an introductory business course, assuming the student was reading at their grade level. The score of the book was in the middle of the spectrum, therefore it would be challenging to a student whose reading level was below an 11th grade level, but it would be challenging enough to meet the needs of most students. Listed below are my sources that I used to correctly complete this assignment.